Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this lovely Cube Axial. We're going to clean this bike up as well, ceramic coat it, make sure all the firmware is up to date on this lovely Sram Rival ETAP axis group set and get it really nice through this service. You can see here the bike is a little bit dirty, but it's not actually too bad. The chain itself, this lovely flat top chain, you can see has next to no wear in it. So we will clean that up regardless, because there is a bit of grit and grime on that chain which we need to clean off so that it doesn't damage this beautiful group set in any way moving forward. So first thing to do is to remove the chain, and then I'm also going to take the wheels off. The through axles on these wheels were a little bit tight. We'll show you on the bench the result of that. We'll make sure that that's torqued up correctly when we put them back on. This has the XDR road hub on this wheel, so we need to take off that cassette which doesn't have the lock ring like a traditional cassette. It's all one piece, and you can see there very little wear, but it is grimy. We just need to clean that up, make sure that the favourite gears are nice and clean and clear from any debris, so that when the bike is ridden it's not going to damage that lovely chain. You can see the derailleur is reasonably okay. There's a little bit of grime building up on those jockey wheels which we'll need to clean off. I am actually removing the bottle cages on this one because I couldn't get to the bolt hole for the front derailleur, so we needed to remove these. And as we're going to wash and ceramic coat this bike, it makes sense to take the bottle cages off as well. And there's also just a spare one there which we're going to remove because we're going to grease the threads to make sure that they don't seize into the frame. It has this lovely top tube under bag on this frame which we've removed, and we'll wash that down and make sure everything's clean there, but we can clean under that as well. See there, the front derailleur is quite dirty and grimy. Again, we'll wash all this down, re-lubricate it all before putting it back on the bike. Now, the pedals on this bike were really tight. I actually had to use a breaker bar to get these off. They were over tightened, so we will make sure that they are torqued correctly when they go back on the bike. I'd imagine these have been off the bike since I last serviced it at some point, and they were just a little bit tight, so we had to get a bar on there to get those off. So they come out now, both drive side and non-drive side, and then we can actually remove this chain set as well. We want to strip this down and clean everything up, and also I want to clean behind it. I also want to check the bottom bracket bearings, see how they feel, see how they are, make sure that everything in that bottom bracket area is okay before we put everything back together. And you can see there again, it's not greasy, it's just been out in wet weather and it's just a film of mud and debris that's on there. It's not greased and thick. So this bike actually is a perfect time to get a bike like this serviced when it's a little bit grimy. You have a little bit of build up of oil on these derailleur wheels. Perfect timing for a service, this one. So we take that derailleur apart because we don't want to douse those jockey wheels in water, and then also take the chain set apart as well, so I can really clean it up, grease everything, make sure everything's nice before we put it all back together. So we'll just take those rings off of the spider there, and that's all now ready to be cleaned up. Ultrasonic cleaning wise, there's not a lot we can actually clean on this bike. We'll do the chain and the cassette, nothing else will go in the ultrasonic cleaner. I don't like to ultrasonic cleaner these electronic group sets, it just doesn't sit comfy with me. I always leave the batteries on these when I'm washing them down because they do have a little rubber seal around them that makes sure that you're not going to get any water into the connectors for those batteries, so leave those on when you're cleaning down the bike. Front and rear derailleur, just to wash down on those. Also this lovely little under top tube bag, we're just going to wash that down as well. Also clean the inside of that just to make sure everything there is hygienic and clean. And then also the rings, again just warm soapy water, washing those down. In this instance there was no need to degrease them, they weren't built up with grease and debris, they were just dirty from the ride, so it didn't need too much to clean this one up. But this cassette has obviously been through the ultrasonic cleaner, and you can see there absolutely spotless now, very nice. Same with the chain, through the ultrasonic cleaner, and then I wash that down with warm soapy water to get any debris that remains on it off, and then we'll dry those down before putting them back on the bike. Jockey wheels, I'm doing those slightly separately. I'm just using a little bit of degreaser on a microfiber towel. That will draw off any of that grease buildup that's on that jockey wheel, but we don't want to wash out the bearings in the centre with degreaser. They do have their own roll of bearings in these, so we just clean up the jockey wheel itself. And then I'm using a little bit of our thread locker here on the derailleur. That will stop it coming undone. With these, that little one that I'm about to do up now If that's took out of it, it actually stops the derailleur working. It's almost like a safety switch, so that if that does ever come undone, it's going to stop changing gear. So you need to make sure that's in correctly, and then the derailleur will continue to work. And then I'm also going to lubricate the pivot points on this derailleur. Just a drop, just a little dot of oil on there. We're using our general purpose oil there. Not too much, just a little dot of oil just to help lubricate that, keep everything flowing nicely. And that's now ready to go back on the bike. And a similar process with the front derailleur, using a little bit of our premium grease on the spring just to stop that going rusty. That will stop any water getting through to it. And then a dot of oil on each of the pivot points on this. I never think any pivot point does any harm to oil it. And that is now also ready to go on the bike. Now you can see here the through axles, I mentioned those when we took the wheels off. You note the thread on the right hand side there, how that's gone very silvery. That's where it's actually been stretched, where it's been over tightened at some point. And we also have those wear marks on the left hand side there, which is a good reason to grease that to help stop that rotation and whatever's happening there from happening again. So quite happy with those through axles to go back on the bike. With the chain set, I'm lubricating the bolts that hold it together. That will actually stop any corrosion coming in from water seeping into those threads or into those fittings. And I'm also using our general purpose grease here on the spider, which I'll actually wipe off and make sure that there's just a little layer between the surfaces that we're putting together. So between the chain rings and the spider, and between the spider and the bolts that are going into it. That will protect it against corrosion and also enable me next time I service the bike to be able to remove it simply and easily like I did this time from the previous service. So we can torque those up, make sure that everything there is tight and correct, and that's also now ready to go back on the bike. And then I can deal with the process of cleaning this bike down. Now I'm using a soapy wash here. Now this bike has been cleaned and polished by us in the past, and just by spraying it like this, it softened up the dirt that was on the bike, and I could see it almost running off before I even started to clean the bike. It was washing away from the bike. So all we needed then was our big softy brush here with a little bit of soap on it to work any debris that was left back on the bike to come off of the bike before we clean it down with a microfiber towel. So you can see we do it in sections. We do the front forks, the main triangle and the rear triangle, and then also the saddle and the saddle bracket and everything, just to make sure everything's clean. And then I use a microfiber towel. Microfiber towels are great. They draw off the water, really help with bringing everything off, and they're nice and soft. They don't scratch. Bikes are slightly different to say car paintwork in that most bikes are a resin finish with a gel coat type finish on the surface of the colourant that's put into the mould when they are made. Some are sprayed, some are then detailed with stickers, etc., but they're not like a paint and lacquer like you get on cars. They are much more hardy really than most paints that are on cars. So we've washed that down, and then we're using our super resin polish here. That will enable any mud and debris that does come onto the bike to really be able to be washed off much easier next time we wash the bike down, as we did this time. This had been previously resin polished, and then when I washed it down, the mud just almost fell off the bike. It was really easy to clean this one down. And then the final process for me on this one is to put some ceramic spray onto this. This really gives it that final coat to really stop the debris from sticking to the bike. It's the road film, the greases and oils that are on the bike when your tyres are rotating and flicking that all up over your frame. This really stops that from binding to the surface that's on the bike and makes it far easier to clean down next time around when you're washing the bike down. Going to also wash the wheels down, so we're using our detailing brush here, warm soapy water again just to wash this down. I can check everything, make sure all the spokes are okay, check the actual rim of the wheel, check that the tyres are all seated nicely and everything is okay with the wheel. So it's a good way of me visually checking the wheel as well as washing it down. And I also check things like the centre lock for the disc. And then I'm also now sanding down this rotor. I like to make sure that every bit of debris is off of that and any score lines in there are smoothed out, stop it squealing. And I'm using a little bit of wire wool there with a little bit of brake cleaner on the spider of that disc itself. There was a little bit of corrosion on there actually, which is what I was cleaning off there. And then I'll also use a microfiber towel again with a bit of brake cleaner to clean off everything that I've done and make sure everything there is right. Now the XDR drive, you have to be a little bit cautious with these when you put them on. It's very easy to strip the threads on these. You want to make sure the tool is in the center before you start spinning it on, so that everything there is square and where it needs to be before it goes back on the wheel. Once that is on, I can torque it up to make sure that it's absolutely spot on when the wheel goes back on the bike. I'm actually about to open up the brake calipers, but what I'm doing here is removing the bleed screw from the shifter itself, because when you do this process, you can never guarantee that there isn't too much fluid in a system, because it may have been bled during its life, and I want to make sure that when I open these pistons back out, I'm not going to get brake fluid pouring all over the shifter itself. So I just popped that syringe in there to make sure that everything was okay there, and then I'll use a little bit of brake cleaner around that to make sure there's no residue that's going to damage that in any way. The Sram system has dot fluid in it, so it's very, very corrosive in comparison with mineral oil, so it's good practice to make sure everything's clean, which is what I'm doing there. Out comes the pivot pins and then the pads themselves. Pads were quite worn on this bike. I did note on the rear, the little safety clip that should be on that pivot pin there is actually missing. So if that pivot pin was to have ever come undone, it could then fall out of the bike. You could then lose the pads. It could literally stop you from braking. It could be quite dangerous. So it's a safety clip really that's on there that was missing. So we will refit that when we put it back together. Now the brake pad on the left there, they are actually life extinct. They were very, very thin in comparison with the new pads that I'm about to fit. So we're actually putting new pads front and rear on this bike. The pads were quite worn really. But this pivot pin, I use a little bit of our anti-seize on the thread, and then the smallest of dot of general purpose grease along the shaft, which I'll work in with my fingers, so there's not a residue amount of grease on there, but it will just help those pads operate a little bit smoother, and then put that safety clip back on there, which was missing, so we've replaced that. The service was worth it for that alone, to have that safety clip on there. Very, very important and worth the service for that alone. Next up, I'm going to put the chain set back on, so I'm just using a little bit of our premium grease here just to help that move into the bottom bracket a little bit smoother. You may notice we had to tap that out, so we want to make sure that we can get that in and out again next time. So on goes the center lock bolt there, so we just do that up and then we'll torque that into place to make sure that this is nice and central and everything done up tightly before we put the front derailleur on. They do have this bearing preloader on these chain sets, so I just made sure that was correct. And then I'm also going to put these pedals in. I'm using a little bit of our anti-seize grease on those, so that I know that next time I can actually get those off should they end up a little bit tight again. But we'll just put those pedals in, and then when we're doing the final process we'll torque those up to make sure they're alright. On goes the front derailleur, and we'll also torque that up before we put the bottle cages back on, and then on goes the rear derailleur. We are going to check the firmware on these as well along the way. I'm just putting a little bit of our anti-seize grease in these riv nuts here to make sure that the bottle cage bolts don't stick into the frame. Quite common really for bottle cage problems, but we don't want that, so we're putting on the bottle cages with fresh grease and make sure that the bolts are nice and smooth in those fittings. So you can see there, both bottle cages back on, everything there is now nice, and we'll also just replace this tool accessory bag that's on the top tube here. So in go the bolts for that one, and then that will slide on, and then after it's slid on we can just tighten those off along the way. In go these axles and the wheels. We will also torque those up to make sure they're not over tightened. On goes the rear wheel and rear axle, and then this lovely chain. You can see what a huge difference I've made to that. It's now nice and clean, nice and shiny. Everything there is beginning to, well, looks like brand new again, so that's quite good. This will all run that bit smoother, change gear a little bit nicer once it's complete. Now I'm just going to do a firmware check and update on this one. So you can see here all the batteries are good. I checked the shifter batteries and the batteries on the components, make sure there's no firmware adjustments. In this instance, this does have a power meter on it, and it did have a firmware update here, so we're just downloading that now and installing it. And obviously with this one we actually had to remove the center of the power meter, so we've removed that, pressed the little button on the top of that to install the firmware. That's now installed nicely, and then we can check that everything is working okay and as it should. So we shift through the gears. There were no adjustments to be made. We didn't have to do any adjustments to this at all. Everything was working as it came off the bike, so very, very pleasing, very easy. Front derailleur also working as it should, no adjustments needed. So again, quite easy, quite pleasing. Now what I'm doing here is I'm checking the brakes, making sure the pads are central to the disc and everything is working okay. We do that front and rear, maybe do a little bit of an adjustment to make sure everything is okay, but in this instance it was. And then the final thing for me to do with the service is to check everything with a torque wrench. Now in the case of this bike, we have serviced it in the past. Everything is actually pretty much where it needs to be, but there's still no harm in going right the way through a bike with a torque wrench, regardless of whether you've done it in the past, because things do come loose and you do need to check them. The steerer tube on this one needed a couple of little turns. That wasn't quite to torque specs, so we made sure that everything was correct there. Brakes we have adjusted, so we needed to torque those. These axles have been off the bike, obviously we took the wheels off, so we need to check those. So there's quite a few things, even though we've done it in the past, you don't want to cut corners by not torquing everything and making sure that everything is tight and correct. Pedals and the through axles, and there's an awful lot that we have disturbed on this bike that we need to make sure is absolutely spot on. So you can see here, everything there is fine. The parts that we haven't touched, even things like the seat post, we check everything. It's all okay, so we're quite happy with the way this bike has come back together. Just need to oil the chain, which is what I'm now doing. Oil each of the little rollers on the chain. I don't douse the chain in oil. I like to do it tactily and make sure that everything's nice, and I'm using a microfiber towel underneath there to turn the rollers as I'm sliding that along the chain to make sure that the oil gets nicely into the rollers on there. And then one other thing we did here, we noticed some debris in the tyre. There were a couple of bits like this. We picked those out because, as you'll see here, how deep this is into that tyre. And there we go, that's a little flint off the road. That is a puncture waiting to happen. That is the rider's next puncture. They don't know it at this point of the service. A few miles down the line, that's going to go through the tyre, and that is a puncture. So this bike is now ready to ride. I think you can see here from the before and afters, we made quite a bit of difference to this. We're getting close to 50,000 subscribers now. So if you are one of those, thank you very much. If you have ordered on our website, we've noticed a few people there who are repeating orders, which is really, really nice. So we've got some good customers and some great friends through the channel that we may never get to meet, but we do notice every one of you. So thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.